civilian Timorese from the rural village of Kraras revolted, killing 14 unarmed Indonesian engineers. In revenge, Indonesian troops and auxiliaries massacred at least several hundred villagers over the following weeks in some of the largest massacres of the 24-year occupation of Timor, during which over 100,000 Timorese lost their lives. 8 years later, in 1991, with Timor still under occupation, thousands of civilians in the capital of Dili participated in a peaceful pro-independence demonstration. Indonesian troops opened fire, massacring an estimated 80 to 200 participants. The demonstration and massacre, now known internationally as the Santa Cruz Massacre, was caught on film by a foreign journalist. Footage circulated around the globe within days. Flash forward to 2011-2012, the period of my main fieldwork in Timor. Indonesian troops have been out of Timor for 13 years. Timor has been officially independent for a decade. Demands for justice and a focus on the suffering of human rights victims have been replaced by a more celebratory nationalist focus on veterans of Timor's heroic independence struggle. Yet there is an enormous gap in the glorification, or valorization, as the Timorese say, afforded to those involved in the two aforementioned acts of resistance. Those involved in the Santa Cruz event, including those still living and those who were killed, are considered among the greatest heroes in Timor, while those connected to the Kraras uprising are essentially forgotten nationally. What can explain this discrepancy? There are a plethora of potential explanations as to why the Kraras event has been virtually forgotten in Timor, particularly in relation to the hyper-memorialized Santa Cruz event. These include the interlinked realities of the different locations of the events, rural versus urban respectively, the locations themselves linked to divisions of class, power, and education, the different timing of the events. The Kraras event occurred when Timor was closed to the outside world, which it was from the time of the Indonesian invasion in 1975 until 1989, and the generational divide. The Kraras actors belonged to an older generation than the Santa Cruz participants. There were also more fatalities in the Kraras case. Finally, and most obviously, the two events had very different outcomes. The Kraras event did not significantly advance Timor's struggle for independence, whereas the Santa Cruz massacre was caught on film and marked a turning point in Timor's struggle for independence. However, in this paper, I offer a different, albeit related, explanation for the disparity in attention paid to the two events. I assert that the Kraras event is not afforded as much attention as the Santa Cruz event because of the nature of the act of resistance that resulted in the reprisals, specifically that those who resisted used armed violence. There's perception in Timor, albeit unspoken, that those who initiated the Kraras uprising are not heroes, or at least not only heroes, but also perpetrators, who were wrong in killing unarmed Indonesians, even as an act of resistance. I argue, along with Timorese from the area, that this attitude is a result of discourses of human rights, transitional justice, and reconciliation, which circulated heavily in Timor's early post-independence period, promoted in large part by Timor's Truth Commission. These discourses emphasized the suffering of the victims of violence and the accompanying wrongdoing or blameworthiness of the authors of violence on both sides or all sides of Timor's struggle for independence. In Timor, at least, human rights has expanded the category of perpetrator to at least partially include those who, in a time before the rise of transitional justice, might have been unambiguously celebrated as resistance heroes. Invaded by Indonesia in 1975, East Timorese originally framed their struggle for independence in the language of anti-colonial liberation, with the main form of resistance being guerrilla warfare. The 1983 civilian uprising in Kraras thus took place in the context of armed revolutionary struggle ordered by leaders of the resistance. However, due to changes in the conflict and in the international sphere, including the rise of human rights, Timor's resistance shifted focus from armed guerrilla warfare to nonviolent civilian resistance, with youth engaging in peaceful demonstrations in the cities aimed at a global audience. The independence movement adopted the language of human rights, turning its attention to the violations being perpetrated by the Indonesian forces, often as a result of these demonstrations. The most famous of these incidents was the 1991 Santa Cruz demonstration and massacre. This turn towards nonviolence and human rights was astute. While Timor's right to self-determination had been recognized by the UN since before the Indonesian invasion, mass global support for Timor's independence was based primarily on a belief that human rights violations in Timor would only stop with self-rule. This should read two versions of rights. As Robert Meister and others have noted, a focus on the body of the innocent victim is at the center of a post-1989 human rights. Meister argues that this is a result of a fixation on the idea of the Holocaust as the ultimate evil and the urgency of preventing another Auschwitz at all costs. Meister writes, quote, "Human rights is predicated on the idea that there is nothing worse than cruelty and that cruelty towards physical animal bodies is the worst of all," unquote. Samuel Moyne, more specifically and forcibly, contrasts the current paradigm of human rights with the politics of third world revolution and guerrilla warfare, arguing that the, quote, human rights movement not only displaced third world revolution and guerrilla warfare, but also targeted it for its most passionate criticism, unquote. Notably, the current version of human rights presents itself as moral and ethical and impartial, as opposed to political or impartial. It is this ostensibly apolitical version of human rights, focused less on rights and more on compassion for the body and pain, that influenced both the successful strategic shift in Timor's independence movement towards nonviolence and Timor's post-independence politics of memory. The circulation of human rights discourses immediately post-independence in Timor occurred primarily via Timor's Truth Commission, the CAVR. Among the ways the commission presented itself as an impartial, apolitical body was by broadly defining the human rights violations it was mandated to investigate, so as to include violations of international humanitarian law. This allowed for investigations of violations not only by Indonesian non-state actors, but also by members of Timor's resistance movement, who the report noted committed 29% of the 18,600 unlawful killings and enforced disappearances that occurred during the Indonesian occupation. The CAVR mandate also extended to the period before the Indonesian occupation to cover violations committed by Timorese against Timorese during a brief but bloody civil war between political parties, thus expanding the period of conflict from the oft-cited 24 years of the Indonesian occupation to 25 years. The CAVR devoted an entire public hearing out of 8 total to examining this civil conflict. In addition, in almost every other public hearing, regardless of theme, the commission included testimonies by Timorese victims of Timorese perpetrators, whether from the Civil War or during the occupation, in addition to Timorese victims of Indonesian perpetrators. The commission focused on violations experienced by Timorese, not Indonesians, and therefore didn't discuss human rights or humanitarian law violations committed by Timor's resistance against Indonesia, as opposed to internally against other Timorese. If it did, the Kraras Uprising would most likely not have fit the definition of a war crime, as it was directed against combatants and avoided unnecessary civilian loss. However, the general message of the commission, sympathy for Timorese suffering at the hands of both Timorese and Indonesian perpetrators, and a corresponding disapprobation of the perpetrators of this violence, certainly implicated those who participated in the violent uprising. An extension of sympathy to Indonesian victims and a correlating critique of the armed violence used to create these victims could be assumed as a logical next step. In fact, speaking in Kraras in 2008 on the anniversary of the Kraras massacres, then President José Ramos Horta in fact spelled out this sentiment in person, shrouded in the language of reconciliation. Horta noted, quote, "I also feel your suffering, but I would like to appeal that the best way for the Timorese is forgiveness and reconciliation, including to forgive Indonesians, because during this fight, Timorese also killed each other, and many Indonesians also died in this land. Therefore, as I have appealed many times before, that even though the biggest responsibility of the Kraras massacre is coming from the Indonesians, however, they also suffer like us. There is no reason to hate each other. As the president, as well as your Mount Boat, big brother, I would like to appeal to all Timorese to avoid violence." While Timor's Truth Commission did acknowledge the illegality of the Indonesian occupation and did emphasize that the overwhelming majority of violations were committed by Indonesian security forces and their auxiliaries, by presenting such an even-handed focus on victims of Timorese and Indonesian violence, the Commission, and leaders such as Ramos Horta, worked to equalize the violence committed by all parties during the struggle and to equally delegitimize this violence. If the dominant, or at least semi-official discourse in Timor's early year of independence was one of victims and violations, by the time I arrived in Timor in 2011 for the main period of my fieldwork, this narrative seemed to have been completely displaced by a more celebratory narrative focused on heroes and veterans of the resistance struggle. The narrative had shifted from everyone is a victim to no one is a victim. Conversely, everyone was now a veteran and a hero. The language of heroes and heroism, often associated with nationalism and linked to resistance, is not a natural fit with the language of supranational human rights. As Susan Neiman writes, people are, quote, not just unwilling, but embarrassed to talk about heroes, unquote. There's a belief that, quote, the Enlightenment ushered in a post-heroic age, unquote. If there is a concept of heroism embodied in human rights, it is the triad of the Western savior rescuing the non-Western victim from the non-Western savage. The failure of human rights to adequately account for resistance, and a distaste in academia for hegemonic nationalist discourses of heroism, has inhibited discussion on other ways in which heroism and human rights might converge, including how values of human rights might affect internal hierarchies of heroism that typically occur in post-liberation contexts. In Timor, a superficial displacement of a narrative of victimhood and human rights by a heroic narrative belies the fact that values of human rights have been incorporated in attempts to determine who are the most heroic Timorese. The most prominent value here concerns the link between culpability and violence. In the post-independence period, where the CAVR and Timor's leaders have expressed sympathy for victims on all sides of Timor's struggle and denounced past violence committed not only by Indonesians, but also by members of Timor's resistance in a kind of democratization of perpetration, survivors of the Santa Cruz massacre have been able to rise to the top of a heroic hierarchy with reference to their action pacifico. Both parts of this phrase are equally important. A focus on the action or demonstration, as opposed to only the massacre, brings to the fore the survivor's agency. A focus on the pacific nature of the demonstration, in which the resistors used banners, not bullets, lends an innocence and purity to the demonstrators' actions and subsequent suffering and death. Through expressions such as this, those who participated in the Santa Cruz event positioned themselves between the two dominant categories of victims and veterans related to the past in Timor, and take on the best of both categories: the bravery and courage associated with the veteran in the classical masculine warrior hero sense, and the innocence, purity, and moral high ground associated with the present-day human rights victim. If the Santa Cruz event looms so large on Timor's national landscape that the leaders have to remind the populace that there were other larger massacres, Kraras, despite being probably the largest single massacre or series of massacre in Timor's history, makes barely a blip on Timor's national memorial landscape. As Mario, a youth from Kraras who was my main informant in the area, plainly stated, quote, "Maybe the reason the Kraras massacre is not so famous is because it resulted from the killings of the Indonesians," unquote. Unlike in the case of Santa Cruz, where the heroism of those who participated in the demonstration is not questioned due to their use of ballots and bullets, this is not the case in the case of Kraras. As a result, my research shows that those who participated in the Kraras uprising were constantly trying to explain their past actions as if there was something that needed to be justified. In interviews and other fora, those involved in the Kraras event stressed how the uprising was ordered from above by the organized guerrilla forces Falintil, particularly by the leader of Falintil, Shanana. Others stressed that the uprising was not triggered by the molestation of women by Indonesian troops in the area, as reported in Timor's Truth Commission report, but in response to what was clearly being argued was the more serious act of Indonesian troops murdering 4 villagers. Still others stressed that it was the Kraras uprising that ultimately led to the pivotal Santa Cruz demonstration and massacre, noting that, quote, "If there was no Kraras, there would be no Santa Cruz and no independence," unquote. A presentation of human rights as moral rather than political is disingenuous. The current version of human rights rests on a particular form of morality, which includes judgments regarding acceptable and unacceptable forms of violence, and thus resistance. Moreover, this particular moral standard has profoundly political as well as ethical effects. It privileges the history of violence of some individuals and groups, allowing them to be leveraged for money, political power, and status, while deeming others unusable. In a post-war context, particularly in impoverished ones such as Timor, where people are competing for scarce resources, this matters tremendously. Not coincidentally, at least in the case detailed in this paper, the unusable past belongs to the rural poor, those already on the periphery of the state. The result is an unfair disadvantaging of people already disadvantaged and damaged by structural violence and war. Moreover, with the cyclical nature of power in history, a privileging of particular histories becomes self-perpetuating. As a result of a post-independence delegitimizing of violence in Timor, there has been a partial rewriting of the history of Timor's resistance so as to exclude armed violence entirely. This rewriting has taken place both among Timorese leaders, who stress a narrative consisting of a shift in the resistance from discord and violence to unity and peace, as well as among internationals. For example, one longtime Solidarity worker, while training foreign election observers in East Timor before the 2007 election, explained to the group that Timor's resistance had been entirely nonviolent. This prompted one of the Timorese in the audience who understood English to pull her aside and correct her. This brings to mind Annie Coombs' observation regarding Robben Island in South Africa and the emphasis on the prison as a place of learning so as to, quote, "soften the taint of either sabotage or political assassinations, which might otherwise mar the heroism of their struggle for a more liberal audience, and particularly for the international tourist in need of a glorious and righteous struggle, whose outcome is not muddied by the mess and ambiguities of war, the armed struggle, and the inevitability of botched operations," unquote. An additional effect of heroizing nonviolent over violent resistance is a forgetting of the goals of the resistance during the early years of the struggle, when armed violence was more favored, in favor of the goals in the latter years when nonviolence was more heavily emphasized. In the case of Timor, these goals were vastly different: a revolution to dismantle existing colonial structures versus a free market state founded on universal human rights, only without Indonesia at its head. The subjects involved in each struggle and the ways in which they presented themselves were also different. The subject of the first phase of struggle was, quote, intimately linked to state, territory, and a historically delineated people, unquote, where the subject of the latter was, quote, deterritorialized, massified, historically unspecified, reliant on invocations of a baseline humanity on a global scale, and associated with superstate institutions, unquote. Finally, human rights contains explicit ideas concerning what the perpetration of violence means, namely a direct committing of physical violence against an enemy. Conversely, human rights' notion of innocent victimhood involves being on the receiving end of violence without having directly committed violence oneself. Yet human rights fails to take into account the production of particular kinds of resistance based on these concepts, resistance that potentially complicates these rigid categories, giving lie in some sense to the innocence of the nonviolent resistor, and making it clear that the two categories of resistors, violent and nonviolent, may be closer than they appear. Initial debates about Timorese using violence against Indonesians in the Santa Cruz demonstration in order to provoke violence have been discounted. Yet there is more uncertainty as to whether nonviolence was used to provoke violence. A senior ex-guerrilla commander, for example, has described the Santa Cruz event as an intentional sacrifice to provoke a turning point externally and internally, noting that it was the intention to create an incident in which many would be killed. He admitted to feeling bad about this in retrospect and acknowledged that it was a human rights violation to sacrifice young people's lives, but said the resistance had no options at the time. Other leaders of the demonstration have spoken similarly. Due to its stigma against armed violence, human rights can force a kind of perpetration of violence, albeit indirectly, against one's own people, those on one's side, in the name of resistance. While I'm certainly not equating the organizing of a march with the potential hope or intention that enemy forces will open up fire so as to create innocent victims with the employment of armed violence, I'm simply pointing out that nonviolent resistance often employs violence in its own way, with the result that the categories of violent and nonviolent resistance are perhaps less dissimilar than they might appear. Significantly, this looser definition of perpetration is something that doesn't seem to be taken account of in human rights discourse or in the politics of memory in East Timor. Thank you.